Just to let you know that we're now live, we are on the stage. So I will make a quick introduction, and then we can jump straight into the conversation. So welcome to the audience, welcome to everybody. It's the first session of the day and the first session of the conference. So it's actually a panel discussion, and the panel discussion will focus on embracing digital disruption and preparing for a new energy era. So, yeah, it goes without saying, very, very excited to have everyone here today, and I hope you find it a really interesting discussion. So, I've had various conversations with the panelists over the last 6 months or so. I believe there is going to be some really exciting nuggets that they can provide. But I'd like to introduce formally each of the panelists. So we have Biju Misra, who is the Director of Corporate Business Transformation and Automation for Enbridge. Nordin Taj, Technology Strategy and Architecture, Digital Innovation and Engineering, BP. Monica Mangler, Global Finance Digital Transformation Program Manager, Chevron. And Arnold Martin, Director of Process Control Technology for the Center of Technical Expertise, Liquide America. And finally, your moderator, Peter Harding, CEO, Kelvin. So before we start, just a very quick reminder. Attendees have joined in listen-only mode, so that means the attendees are completely muted. But there are various areas within the system that I would encourage you to use. So I already mentioned this before, but on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a Q&A functionality. If you have any questions for the panel, for the moderator, or just in general, you can drop your questions in there, and towards the back end of the session, we will select them, read them out, and answer them insightfully. So that's it really from me. I don't want to delay the juicy content that's about to come. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the moderator for the session. Once again, Peter Harding, CEO, Kelvin.
Great. Mark, thank you. And to the panel, I had a great opportunity to have one-on-one sort of conversations with each of you. And we're still writing on Arnold, but we'll get going regardless. And I think what I wanted to do is, based on sort of the first set of discussions that we had, sort of provide a little bit of additional perspective around sort of each of you and sort of maybe some of the things that you bring. And so I came up with sort of the one-liner for each of you, because we can't go, everyone has these incredible backgrounds, right? So lots of experience, lots of wonderful capabilities. So I wanted to just kind of summarize it. And so I wanted to introduce the ambassador of impact, that's Monica Mangler, the father of invention, Nordin Taj, Dr. Change, Biju Misra, and last but not least, the disruptor, Arnold Martin. Because for each of you in these conversations, it was really interesting. You all have very, very different perspectives around sort of what it takes to be successful as we're embracing digital disruption. And I think today the goal is to be able to bring out some of those different points of view, but also be able to think about where there's commonalities and differences, because I think that that's going to be where there's kind of richness in the discussion. So in terms of getting going, I wanted to just, start by saying, even though we oriented this discussion towards technology, one of the big takeaways was, frankly, how important people are. And in that sense, I think it would be great, Biju, to start with you. When you're thinking about sort of what it takes to be successful, like what are some of those kind of critical ingredients that you see in achieving digital disruption? Sure. And then again, people can pile in, but Biju, let's start with you and see where it goes.
Sure. So I think disruption is meant to kind of challenge what's going on. And we generally tend to be comfortable with what's going on, not because that's just kind of how we were wired and oriented. I think it's a good thing to say, there's the people element to it. So one is, of course, I think you have to kind of lead from the front. Because change is difficult to everybody. I mean, just think about, however, I would say if you look at what's happening in COVID-19, many of us changed overnight, as a matter of fact, right? We went from never imagining anything that could have been done so remotely to actually doing it remotely overall. Like within a week, I think even for us, all 14,000 employees were working in a different way, which is dramatic in itself. So I think it's not so much that people don't want to change. I think there's always a purpose and a reason to do why. And what I find in disruption is when that happens, we tend to just think that we don't have to explain things and people just get it. I think COVID was very clear. You had to do it. There was no other way around it. So I think that we can take some comfort in the fact that people are willing to change if they actually understand the context of the change and why that actually means what it means, right? And the second one, I think, is a leadership question, which is, I don't think this can be delegated. I don't think you can have other people do this. I think you have to roll up your sleeves and actually understand what this disruption is and be in the middle of it to actually explain to people. And you are probably best oriented to explain to your team why this is important than anybody else. Anybody else, I would say. Those two things, I think, are probably critical, besides all the other technical stuff, which is the how. Yeah.
Totally. No, I think you made that point very clearly around sort of, it's, you need the consistency of commander's intent, right? You need the ability to say, like, this is what we're going to do, and keep saying it over and over again. And Monica, in terms of your experience, you know, in terms of driving a lot of the changes at Chevron, like, how does that resonate with you? And what have you sort of seen kind of around the people dimensions and what's critical in terms of making that work?
You know, it's a great question. And actually, Bijo, you captured it very well. And I'll provide a practical example because we kind of embraced the so-called bottoms-up people believing in it and top-down leaders believing in it. You know, so what I'm doing right now is I'm leading the first S4 deployment within the Chevron environment at the enterprise scale. You know, large scale project, very structured, very focused, high visibility. So that is where we have very, very deep leaders, I would say integration within the project and the program itself to drive that change across the organization, drive the expectations across the organization. Simultaneously, we also have bottoms-up approach going on where more targeted use cases, more targeted use of technologies, new digital solutions can be used by people as they realize how they want to actually simplify or modernize their own work processes. That is where you really don't need a top-down buy-in bureaucracy from approval perspective, and people themselves become the drivers of change. So Bijo, I think you captured it exactly the same. What I was going to say, you do need for large-scale efforts leaders, passion and drive to really push it forward in the organization, yet you don't want to kill the bottoms-up innovation and handcuff the people who are really in the trenches. You want to give them the flexibility to make the decisions and empower them to make the right decisions to move forward quickly and nimbly.
And that dovetails, you know, Norden, with some of the conversation we had around how you think about building creativity into your teams. You talked about sort of like the need for innovation and how that works. And I think building on sort of what Monica was talking about, I think particularly, frankly, from a bottoms-up perspective, like, how do you think about successfully embracing that creativity and bringing that into your team?
Yeah, so what I think, you know, I think we covered the topic very well. The change and creativity, you know, if you want to be creative, you have to change the organization culture, organization structure, and empowering. We also talked about empowering, you know, empowering employee to be able to do things differently. So that's how the creativity comes. And I want to point out like 7 different ways, you know, you could be creative, and what are the ingredients of organization element that will foster creativity in the company. So the one is that you have to, you know, whoever wants to be creative, the organization, we have to focus on the domain expertise. You have to, everybody, this is a change kind of that you have to make sure that people try to learn, have a learning culture and get a domain expertise that will drive creativity. Another point is that you should have an appetite to take risk. If you don't take risk, you cannot do new things and you're not going to be able to drive innovation. And again, the confidence is also important. People have to have a confidence to be able to do things which has not been done before. And then have a time, organization has to provide time for people to think and be creative and fight for the failure. You know, you should not be afraid to fail. You have to fail fast and get up and do new things. So that's how you keep iterating things, and then you become, you know, more creative and you invent new things or innovate new things. brainstorm different ideas, just try to do things differently. This is again tied up with change. The way we did things before, you have to make sure that you do differently and try to see, how that new things add value and explore multiple options. You always try to do things same way that we have done in the past. It has to change. You have to explore multiple ideas. Maybe, the ideas that you have, new ideas that you have has not been tried before, and you will get a lot of resistance from the organization, but you need to try it. Like going back to fight for the failure, you fight, it may fail, but you have to fight it out and then be successful. So those are the things that I wanted to bring up here.
Yeah, and I want to sort of push back a little bit because I think there's, I sit here in Silicon Valley and there's this culture of, kind of the Zuckerberg, like move fast and break things. Like, let's be realistic, right? We can't move fast and just break things. We actually have to move fast and build things. We have to be in a position where you're sustaining a lot of these real assets. Because if you just go, you can't just turn the server, on again and off again and it resets, right? That's not, like, we're talking about physical systems where there's real impact when you start to just turn these machines off, for example. And so how do you balance that desire for innovation, that need for change, with the realities of the fact that, like, sometimes when you make that decision, there's a real risk. There's a real risk from a safety point of view. There's a real risk in terms of, like, production impact, so how do you think about that piece? Because it is typically like kind of a change killer, right, in a number of situations, because people don't want to do that.
So, Peter, if I want to add here, so a lot of technologies, when we're talking about digital transformation, we have a lot of technologies, and they're passionate about technology. So the only view that they have is the technology, and they try to do things, make things happen. Yeah. They don't look at the business aspect of it. And in our company, we have to really look at it from that perspective, that if this innovation or this technology deployment is really going to add value, or it's just going to be technology. Yeah. That's where I always, when we were chatting about it, we said that's the difference between an invention and an innovation. Invention is something that has been created, but it doesn't get any business value. Innovation is an invention when you turn an invention into something which drives business value, then it becomes an innovation. So that's a perspective that I have. Yeah, you have to kill things, but the things which is really adding value, you have to drive it to the solution, all the way to the end.
Yeah.
And there's also, I think, competent failure and incompetent failure. That's a distinction, right? Which is, I think.
Well, let's talk about those two, because I
agree. I agree with Taj completely. I think you have to be in a position where but there is something called competent failure, where you're kind of going into looking at as broad of a picture as you can in the context of what you're doing, and it may not work, but it's not because you're incompetent at doing it. It's because you've considered everything possible, and maybe something missed. Right? Yeah. And in terms of assets that are underground or above ground that have catastrophic impact, I think that goes back to managing risk and structure and governance. And I'm all there for lean governance, right? I don't believe in 1,400,000 people trying to figure this out and trying to checks and balances because this slows things down. But I think you can have competent people who can look at something and say, that makes sense. What you don't want is incompetent failure, where you have no clue and you're just like going at the speed of light, and you're also breaking things at the speed of light, and that's pretty much the death of you, right? So that's what I would say for that.
You touched on, in our conversation, governance in a way that, frankly, nobody else did, and I actually thought it was a really insightful approach to thinking about governance. And can you talk a little bit about, I'm going to say, good governance versus bad governance?
Sure.
Yeah, because I think
I mean, I've done enough large programs where you look at failures in general. And if you look at failures across these programs or projects, and you wonder, if you look at the structures, the number of people involved, you always wonder, how is it possible that all these people are involved and you still didn't make it?
Totally.
And I would assert that it's because there's governance for governance sake. I think the role of governance is in anything, whether it's innovation, whether it's delivery, is to make things happen in a safe and reliable way, not to have more checks and balances because that takes the team away from doing the work. And then when the team is not doing the work, they fall behind. Then what do you say? Oh, we need more governance to check them why they're not doing the work. That drives them to put more reports and more KPIs and more not doing work. And it's a really bad thing. So I think I'm a firm believer in lean governance, which is what is the minimum that you need to get going, number one, and two, how are you going to help drive success?
Yeah.
Not, I don't feel good, so now I'm going to get Monica to go and create 1,400 reports so that I can feel good. Yeah. But when she's doing that, she's not going to do the work, right? And you can see failures across the board. Hundreds of people, risk managers, VP, like all these people involved. You kind of wonder, it couldn't be just a team. Can't be, right? So that's what I would say. Maybe a little controversial because I don't believe in layers of structure that way. But I don't know what other people think here. But
so
can I just jump in here for a quick minute, Peter, if you don't mind? So, I actually both what Noor you said and Biju what you said make a lot of sense, and I don't think it's controversial. I really don't think, because I think your distinction between invention and innovation is really good. Because innovation is really solutioning. Right? You're trying to address a practical business problem. So that was really, really good. But Biju, going back to your question on governance, I completely agree with you that governance has to be for a reason. But I do want to say that the pace of technological innovation is so fast today. That if you don't have leaders who actually understand, and when I say leaders, I mean because these are the people who are also defining the governance in a way and keeping that oversight to make sure that right decisions are being made. They also themselves have to understand more than just a number. They have to understand conceptually what is it that is being done and why is it being done. And I think that is very important because that does ask many of the people to get into a little bit of trenches, at least conceptually. Yep. And I think if people stay away and they say, my job is just to be a governance, so that's where the risk really comes, because then you really miss out that understanding piece, because today's pace of technological innovation, I think, it demands more hands-on awareness than what people have been used to giving in the past.
I agree with that. Yeah,
so I have a point to make here. So I agree with what's being discussed about the governance. In my view, I agree with Biju, what you said about lean governance and the right people in the governance board, not the people who are not relevant to the work that's being governed. And in this, what I also wanted to point out here that in the digital transformation, organizations are empowering people. So a lot of things are being done at the very bottom. We don't want to create bureaucracy to stop things. We want it to move fast, So that's why what we discussed earlier, that it has to be at the bottom up. People who are in the trenches, they have to do things, they have empowered to do things. But an organization the organization structure is going with more silos so that they can do things, faster. But we also wanted to create a layer across the organization so everybody understand what's going on in every area of the organization, so we can reuse things, we can share things, learnings and all those kind of things. So agree with all being discussed, the governance has to exist, but my point is that it has to be relevant governance. It's not just the people who have no clue about what's being governed and then they create another kind of bureaucracy. We don't want that.
Yeah, and I would challenge that. Not necessarily that concept, but I would say that from a leadership perspective, instead of finding ways to slow the pace of change because we're not able to deal with it, I would argue, and similar to what Monica said, is that you should actually learn faster. Right? You need to push yourself to learn faster so you can keep up with the rate of change. Not find ways to slow it down, because depending upon the sector you're in, depending upon the business you're in, you could die tomorrow as a result of it. Because your competitors aren't sleeping.
Yes, that's the key for accelerating digital transformation, because technology changes very fast. And if you don't have a learning culture, if you don't learn new things faster, you're going to be behind. Just like what you said, Biju, that your competitor is going to beat you. Yeah.
So it's easy to say all that, but how do you do it? Because let's be realistic. Many of us have been in significant situations where like this stuff doesn't happen, right? Where you change a version, you end up with people who don't actually, believe in the benefits. You have leaders that are consistently chasing the next shiny thing that somebody has sold to them. It's 3-letter acronym, and buzzword soup, around what you're trying to do. So how do you overcome that? And actually, like, then how do you get to impact? Because I think, Monica, like, one of the things that we've talked about is you got to be able to show results, right? So like, how do you break through a bunch of that stuff to be able to then get to something that actually says, like, this really does create impact in our organization?
No, great question, Peter. I think transformation is a very broad term in my view, and sometimes I feel it also gets misused. Mm-hmm. Everything is transformation, right? So I think my biggest learning, and this is how we have actually utilized it within our organization, is how do you actually break transformation in a manner that is actually consumable? So what do I mean by that, right? So when you and I talked about it, I was chatting about how it's a multi-pronged approach or a two-pronged approach that we take, which is fundamentally you've got structured efforts, which are very well managed, good governance, good oversight. And then you've got these bottoms up, people empowered, people driven change that is happening within the transformation space. So the lower targeted, more precise, use case driven, efforts are being driven by businesses at a much lower level within their own targeted environment. Structured efforts also, in all honesty, can be huge disruptors for businesses. Adoption is not easy. Change management takes time. How do you break those transformation efforts in consumable chunks is where it really comes down to, because one thing is there, when we look at the kind of digital change that's happening today in the market, a lot of it comes down to information and data. And that has been the most federated component. Information has been the most federated component, especially across large organizations. So, taking control of that, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, taking control of it, defining standards around it, that's not an easy job. And what that really does is, in order to really drive traction, not only do you have to break the journey in consumable chunks, you also have to drive value in consumable chunks. Mm-hmm. So if I think from our perspective, where we started, a lot of our focus was actually on standardization and simplification of data. And how do you make information accessible to people? So when I think about where does the benefit come from that particular kind of a journey, it starts from efficiency savings. Mm-hmm. My people don't have to now spend money collecting information. They can actually spend time and effort actually analyzing that information and coming up with the business support decision making, right? So that's the efficiency side of it. You're just starting with it. Over time, as you enrich that information, that's where you can actually build intelligence into that information, which can lead to additional value savings, additional, value for the enterprise as a whole over a period of time. So my point is, it's not only the start of the transformation journey, which is going to be needed to be consumable so business can adopt and adapt, but you also need to get the message out that the benefits are going to be actually a journey. Yeah. And it's only over time that you can really realize the full potential of the transformation you're going after.
No,
it won't be overnight.
It's a great point. I'm gonna speak for Arnold because unfortunately he seems to be having technical issues. But like he talked about how the need to spend the money to build the roads is actually the biggest challenge. And then once you've actually built the roads, i.e. the infrastructure, the data aggregation, the things that are necessary to be able to bring this information together, at that point in time, then you can start to get the value of the commerce that goes across those roads and the retail and the housing that sets up along those roads and sort of the opening up of that. But oftentimes that's the hardest dollar to get, which is how do you basically get that initial investment that's required to be able to put that infrastructure in place in the hopes of being able to benefit down the line. And I think that's a big, a significant challenge.
No, yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's always, a lot of these better realization plans, I think people are skeptical Just if you look at across the landscape, there's lots of things that don't work in general in industries. You're like, you know what? How many more implementations will you do? This didn't happen, that didn't happen, and so on. And even if you look at, but there are some things like automation. Process automation is fairly black and white. You're kind of doing some things today, you're not going to do them tomorrow. So you can be, there are cases like that. But I think how you do it, Peter, that's a good question. And I would argue that leaders in organizations just need to reflect what's happened the last year and a half. And use that as a thinking and reflection point as to what were the common things that happened. And I happened to work for a company that was really good at kind of managing through the whole thing, communicating really effectively with people, and being very hands-on about people first and what was going on, where things were, and how people were feeling, etc. I think there are some golden nuggets in this experience over the last year and a half that can be applied to transformation about how we intended as a global community move people from doing one thing to doing completely different. And all these processes that we thought were never going to be done remotely were being done remotely and actually probably more effectively than before. And I think the core elements are, I think leaders were more hands-on. I think communication was fabulous. I think intent and objective were clear, right? I think those are the elements that at the end of transformation, if you were to apply those, I think you would have more successes than you do today. And the value proposition was clear.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, everybody knew why we were doing it and why it needed to get done. And then, to Monica's point, everybody kind of did their part because they understood the objective that was there. And I think that applies to transformations across. A lot of times people just don't know. And the more we delegate, the more we don't want to be in the trenches and face those difficult questions we may get from people or of our own team saying, I don't know, that's like, I'm not really sure I'm comfortable. The more we're going to have cases where transformations will take longer and they may not always work.
Peter, can I just add some? Sorry, Peter, go ahead, please.
After you, Monica.
No, thanks. One thing I would add to what Biju said is, especially about the leader's personal engagement. I think many a times I find it's not just that the leaders need to conceptually understand and be a part of that, the drive for change. I think what is very important, many a times we forget it, and I've been in many discussions, both internally and externally, when we tend to focus too much on the tool, on the technology, but that's only an enabler.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's an enabler. And I think it has to start with a strategy and a vision. Where do you want to go? Do you really want to embark on a large journey? It only makes sense to embark on a large journey if you've got a strategy and a vision to back it up.
Yeah.
If you don't have that and you're looking for some targeted solutions, maybe that's not the right approach. And I think that is where the so-called governance, leaders engagement becomes really critically important, is what is the strategy and the vision that you're starting with? Because the vision needs to define the strategy. And that needs to define the approach as you move forward. And sometimes I feel that we tend to get too focused on the solution, a technical solution, when that's only an enabler.
Yeah.
So I can just use one comment here. So the success is an intersection of strategy, capability, technology, and culture. This all just like what Monica mentioned, technology is just one piece of it. And I would say it's a small piece of it. There are a lot of bigger pieces. The culture, organization culture, and the capability plays a key role for successful transformation.
Yeah, and culture starts at the top.
Yeah.
Always. Yeah. Right? Like change happens driven by the things you pay attention to.
And that is the longest lead time element. It takes for our company, we started on this journey way back, it's been years, and now we can really see the things have changed. The people has to change, start thinking in a different way, just like a growth mindset, learning culture, appetite for the failure and try new things. And if you keep trying new things, you will hit the innovation, you will hit success.
Yeah, and Biju, I was picking up on as well what you were talking about with regards to the fact that over the last 18 months, there's actually great evidence of the value of innovation on two dimensions. One, what can be done? Because I think that there's historically been reticence for people to try stuff because they're like, we can't do it. And I'm going to come back to an example you gave to me on the phone, which was at one point in time, the expectation was it was 30 days or so for a new user to be onboarded, right? And rather than accepting that, your team and maybe you said, well, what if we do it in an hour? Like, what if that's the expectation? How do we reframe the problem, not to just accept all of the constraints that have previously bound what we can do, but rather saying, wait, no, why not? Like, it's a new user onboarding, right? For example, it should be 5 minutes. And I'm wondering whether or not in your organization over the last, call it 16 months, you've seen evidence where people have been like, well, we have to. Like, necessity is the convention, right? So, like, we're just the fathers, but like, let's talk about the mother. Like, how do we think about that?
Well, absolutely. I think, and again, I think from a leadership perspective, we've always underestimated people in the context of governance and change management. I think that's been our answer because we've been uncomfortable kind of dealing with it. So our answer has been, well, everybody else is difficult, is because they don't want to change. I don't think that's been the issue because 18 months has shown that people will step up and be resilient and really engage and participate in solutioning to make things work.
Yeah,
I think organizations have suffered in general by leaders who have been uncomfortable, pushing their own comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I think we've used that as a way of saying it's everybody else's issue. And I think you could probably go across sectors, across industries, you'll find phenomenal use cases of people who have just gotten together and solved a whole bunch of things. When we went remote, I think the first month then we ran, people were like, I didn't even know this was possible. It happened. The company operated, financial statements came out, operations was continuing. Yeah, there was things that you had to kind of adapt across because energy company, majority of the folks are in the field, it's all a work asset. Sure, there were things that we had to figure out, but people figured out. The company didn't suffer any, any risk of that sort. It managed everything, managed incidents, emergency, everything continued.
Yeah.
Right? And if anything, I think other process gaps and others may have been highlighted as a result of the fact that, Peter, you and I weren't sitting next to each other and I couldn't just talk to you. Totally. So I think organizations gotten better as a result of it. And it's because of the people on the ground, right? And I'm not discrediting leaders. I think it's been our issue that we've been uncomfortable challenging people and asking that question and asking them to rise to a different level of thinking. Because we've been uncomfortable as to what happens to us if that would actually come true.
Yeah.
And I think that applies to transformation as well. I think 18 months have been phenomenal in many different ways and really, debilitating in others.
Yeah.
Because there have been a lot of consequences around mental health of people and I think, right, and deaths and losses and so on. But in that has come, I think, a different level of resilience from a leadership perspective as well as people. So I think we should be kind of proud of what's happened of people on the ground, the amazing job they've done across sectors. Lots of ideas there.
Completely agree. And I think what's interesting is then how do you continue to carry that momentum, right? Because you're sort of at this point where you can continue to push for digital transformation as we are, based on the evidence of success. But we also know that there is a very real trend towards what I describe as analog regression, right? Which is like, we're just going to go back to doing it the way we did it because it was kind of what we were comfortable with before. And we settle back into the fact that we want more people with more opinions, and more of what we did previously. Like, how do you sort of fight that trend? Because it's real, because in many ways it's regression to the mean.
Yeah, I mean, I can go. So one is, I think you have to look at the generation that's coming into the workforce that will have lived through this in many different ways, and I think that boat sailed. I think organizations will have to change in how to think about it because what is coming in from a workforce perspective will be dramatically different.
Yep.
Hands down, it'll be different. Two, I think you have to always ask that what if question now, saying what, if I could do everything I was going to do differently and remotely in a week of time, and everything was going to take 2 years, but I did it in a month only because I had to, what stops me from doing it again? And I think that forces priority, because you can't have everything be number one priority where everything is in a week, right? Like there's a level of prioritization that goes, but definitely I think vision and strategy, I think both have mentioned, I think that's a great thing. I think that connection of work to strategy as to what furthers it, that would force prioritization of the one or two things that you can actually do really quickly and really fast and really safely, versus everybody's priority is a new priority. And I think both of them have done an eloquent job of saying, if you can't prove the value of it, then take a number on the line and stand and give other people a chance to show up and actually move the company forward. I think that's just work. I don't think we're going to go back in that thinking. I think it's that boat sailed. We have no choice but to not continue this path.
So I would agree, we're not going back. And I would also say that the technology played a key role, to get us where we are today. So expectation has also changed. For example, I'm just going to give you an example of one technology, which is a cloud. Just take as a cloud. Yeah. So a company used to have, on-site high infrastructure, and when you have to do something, you have to procure. It takes months and months, to procure the hardware and stuff. Now with the cloud technology, you can just provision any infrastructure you want in like hours, and you have an up and running, and you can do things faster than what you used to do before. And you also, not only that, but you have a lot of expertise available at your hands, which you don't have internally not available, but expertise available in the cloud that you can tap on, do things faster.
Yep. Yeah, I think I would agree with both, Noor, yourself, and Vito. I think change is here to stay. I think 18 months have really taught us to evolve, and pretty much everybody has adapted pretty well and with success, frankly speaking. I yet to come across, at least within our own company, we went 100%, we deployed 100% remote in a globally distributed workforce, multiple time zones, 100%, and you mentioned, Biju, everything else within the company continued. Operations continued safely, right? Companies did file their SEC filings. Earnings were going out. Calls were being handled. Investors were being engaged, right? So things have continued, and I foresee that continuing. Though, Peter, you used the term regression back to the mean. I think it is going to be a watch point. I think there's a conscious watch out needs to happen, because it is easy to fall back. I think there's a big consciousness that things cannot go back as they were, because we have proven it otherwise collectively, pretty much everywhere. But it is a watch point. I think this is something where that true leadership comes into play, that we do not regress back to the way we were comfortable, just because after 1.5 years of change, we have to go back to the offices. I think we just have to keep a very conscious eye on it. And that will require effort from the leader's perspective.
Yeah, and as much as I'm here I come across me like shooting leaders down, and they're people too. It's hard. Like none of this is easy, right? It's not easy to live in it. It's not easy to lead in it either. Yeah. And I just look at the example of Enbridge and the phenomenal job everybody's done, just kind of rally around the point and really be engaged in the process and really kind of reaching out. I think it's tough. It's tough to be a leader in these moments because of uncertainty and ambiguity, and even in the sense that there may be industries where there's more predictable, but it's not. And it's tough. It's really tough. It really kind of gets to the core of your gut, and really you have to kind of reflect on what you're about. And so I think it's difficult for both. But that's why leaders get paid what they're paid. So
and that's more. We totally agreed, and I think in the customers that in the companies that we've worked with where we've seen significant change, it is always very much a top-down driven, I think consistency of approach and volition to overcome the resistance, and that's a really it does take real strength to do that, and it isn't always rewarded. And I think that's the other thing that I wanted to understand from each of you. I talked about impact, but Biju, you touched on if you can't show value, get to the back of the line. How do you show value? And how do you do that in a way that is going to really resonate? Because it needs to not just resonate, at the CFO level necessarily. It needs to resonate, across different parts of the organization. I can have all the, Norton, to your point, I can have, all the invention in the world, but it's the innovation, it's the adoption of that into something, and then hopefully the value that's created, which justifies why you've actually gone through this change to begin with. And so how do you think about being able to capture that?
So if I take, address this, so I think the value, it's a definition of value. What is value for an organization? So you have to define value first. And I would say, anything that is not fulfilling goals towards your strategy, if you're not following your strategy, the vision and strategy, and it's not going to add value to organization goal. So you have to look at from that perspective. For example, oil and gas company, our biggest ambition today, right now, is to go to net zero, right? So we have to reduce our carbon footprint. So anything we do, for example, in an IT, even some people cannot connect the dots of an IT project. But IT project, the way you deliver a project also contributes to your net zero goal. Right. So that, in my view, is a value. So anything that has an organization strategy and ambitions, fulfillment, part of it, that is really a value generator for a project.
Monica, how do you contribute to net zero with your S4?
So I think it's a great point, Noor, you're saying, and I'm going to broaden the response beyond just a net zero contribution, because I think there is an ask in the market, as you said, with respect to net zero. I mean, our logo, frankly speaking, at this particular point in time is higher returns, lower carbon. I mean, that is literally a four-word logo that we have, which is what Chevron stands behind. So when we think of, undertaking projects and defining value, I think I'm going to give a little bit more of a tactical response, which is a little bit more broad, because that is where really the rubber hits the road, right? Yeah. I can talk of my strategy. Depending on my strategy, my vision, and then my strategy, how do you drop it into consumable chunks? And then for each consumable chunk, you really need to figure out what is the value proposition I'm driving from that consumable chunk, because unless you can articulate that, a broad buy-in from the various stakeholders, internal and external, becomes very difficult. So for us, I will say our biggest issue, frankly speaking, was access to information in a quick and a timely manner, because it was just very federated. Over the period of time, we have evolved in a very complex technical landscape, which has led to information being dispersed. A lot of time just gets to collecting information. How do I get my information, right? And that was our starting point from the effort that I'm leading right now, which is just the starting point. How do I actually standardize my data? How do I centralize my data so information is available and decisions can be made of that information? So that was the value proposition for us: simplification and standardization, both from a functional perspective, which is primarily data and information, and from a technical perspective, you're simplifying your technical landscape. So that was our starting point. Again, the vision and the strategy much broader, but for the consumable chunk, how do you make it actually for someone to be able to understand and get their heads wrapped around it? And that's where really the change comes from. You have to define it in a manner that people can understand and can rally behind it. So that's where we started, and it's going to continue.
That alignment between vision, sort of vision, strategy, tactics, and being able to make sure that you have those things coordinated appropriately, that is one of the great challenges from for any team. But it is particularly acute here if you don't have that leadership that understands where they want to go, and then the ability to correctly and sort of succinctly be able to communicate that across the team. You're not going to be able to get to that.
And I think you have to do that with strategy as well, right? I think you have to make strategy consumable as well.
So everything has to tie up.
That's right.
Initiatives at the bottom has to tie up to your vision, so everything has to line up.
Yeah, I've seen this strategy on a page thingies, which are really easy to understand for anybody, because they kind of relate to what it is. Right, because at the end of the day, the best definition of strategy I've heard is, strategy is the actions that you take to create a defensible monopoly in the marketplace.
Yeah.
That's the only reason it exists, right? If it's not making you win, it's just lots of ether and
right
stuff, right? So
there's been a lot of, we've talked a lot today about sort of the elements which, for success, right? And we talked about sort of what are the people dynamics, team dynamics, et cetera. Part of this also, though, is like we are talking about technology, right? And I'm curious to sort of get a sense for some of the technologies that actually you are embracing. Norton, you talked about just kind of cloud in general and what that looks like. But what are some of the other ones, be it sort of industrial IoT, different types of collaboration software, other tools that you're seeing are going to sort of support whatever that mission and strategy may be? And then frankly, sort of what are some of the consequences of that? Like, I think understanding how that impacts organizations is really important. So curious to get thoughts on the disruption.
So if I start, I would say, in my view, the cloud is the key, the fundamental, which will make things go faster. Another technology that I'm working on, and I think it will drive big change in organization, the way we operate and the way we think, is the IoT and AI. Big efforts going on in that direction, and it's a game changer. And what technology is going to do, the behavior of this technology will have an impact on the behavior of an organization, and it goes hand in hand with the change in organizations to adapt to these technologies to drive business value. Yeah. So, in a nutshell, these are the three key technologies. I know there are a lot of technologies that complements these, but these is really going to be a game changer going forward.
Yeah. And Monica, that sounds like, when we talked about the access to information, sort of today, if you think about your, heterogeneous ERP systems, right, that you're sort of trying to then aggregate, and changing the way in which the information is now accessible potentially through cloud interface, thinking about what does that enable you to do, right? Do differently in terms of new business and otherwise. It would be, how do you think about that?
Very much in line with what Noor said, actually. So when we think about whether they are structured ERP efforts or they are IoTs and AIs, I think once the information is available and accessible, you can actually build the intelligence on that is needed. Now, on the IoT side, a lot of this work is being done across various business units within Chevron also, where, for our offshore platforms, for our drill rigs, we are testing various things. So, I think there is a great consciousness and a great passion and drive to move forward in many of these evolving areas to make sure that we can leverage these technologies effectively for the corporation. But at the end of the day, from where I sit, and I'm mostly a back office support operation person, if you think about it, I'm a finance person, professional, right? It really comes down to information access.
Yeah.
And leveraging that information to make the decisions. Whether you put sensors, radars, chips, whatever you want, at the end of the day, you're basically making information available in a manner that you can actually build intelligence on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think definitely cloud, cloud again goes back to some of the leadership things. I think we've moved in that direction for sure. I think we'll continue moving in that direction. I think IoT and all these things. And how do you empower the men and women in the field to give them as much information as possible for the work that they do? The other thing I think is also at a broader perspective is how organizations in the sector will deal with communication and public relations in an age of social media. And what does that actually mean, and how do you respond to it? Where does sentiment analysis fit in? What does that actually, how do you actually deal with the public and other stakeholders out, whether it's ESG and others, so that you're able to communicate more effectively in a generation that is living on its phone all the time? I think that will be a shift for many organizations in this, because I think there's work there, but I don't think we've really kind of thought through exactly what that means. And I think that'll change the world with AI and machine learning and all that stuff.
So that. Thanks, Vijay. One more point I just remember. Since we are talking about technology, so yeah, these technologies are there, but like we discussed before, the technology is changing fast, technology is changing fast. So you have to, your organization structure has to adapt to the new technologies quickly. So one of the things that we need to make sure that whenever we deploy this technology, we try to follow more of, microservice kind of structure. Right now, just like Monica was talking about ERP system, we also have huge state of ERP, which is more monolithic environment. And to make the changes to the monolithic, it takes quite a bit of time. So if you're going forward with the technology, if you adopt the more modular and microservice kind of a structure, that will help you move forward faster.
Yeah, and last point on, and Monica's finance, so she may like that. I think in all of this, as we're adding things in technology, I think if you don't manage it properly, you can have your cost way out of whack. The cost of technology will be so enormous that you're going to start wondering as you create more technical debt whether it makes sense or not. So I think that will force prioritization on the right things that deliver value, because otherwise your costs will just keep increasing. Cloud's good. Cost increases unless you balance it out somewhere else.
Yeah, you have to balance the technical debt. Good point. And I was, it's really, I can talk about it for some time, but I think we're running out of time. But that's a very good point. Technical debt, we need to watch for it.
That's right.
Mark, welcome. You've got any additional questions you want us to cover, or do you want us to keep going on this?
Well, it sounds like you could probably keep going for days. It's been which is a good thing. It's been a really good conversation. So, no, I just thought I'd make an appearance just to let you know that there's now 8 minutes left until the end of the session. I've been dropping messages to people to ask some questions. So there are some questions in the Q&A box if you'd like to take those, and or.
I'll just pick up one which I think is relevant, just in general, which is around how do we think about sort of the impact from a carbon footprint perspective on some of the different technologies, because clearly there's a cost of that from when we think about not just the dollar cost in terms of cloud processing, but also what we're doing in terms of that piece. And so are your teams talking about it? Are you talking about carbon footprint in the context of innovation? It would be just good to know if that's part of the dialogue.
Yeah, I think if you look at all these ESG commitments and so on, I think it's part and parcel of the companies in the sector. I think you're always looking to see what that means and where can you get benefit as you go. I think data center, cloud, all that was usually typical places where you can go after some of these things as well as and I think there's innovation as a result of just commitments organizations have made. I think that's going to drive all different ways we can find other things across the board, not just in technology, but across the board. There's lots of focus of the company, at least, to see how do we, because we made some commitments for 2030 and we're going to keep them.
Yeah.
I think that's, again, the kind of the constraint thinking. There's a great book, I think it's called The Beautiful Constraint, where you kind of say, when you put constraints on a team and you force them to work within that, they come up with all sorts of ways to manage it. Those things that we do.
Yeah. Monica, what about you from a finance perspective on that?
Now, I completely second what Biju is saying. There's a great consciousness, great awareness, and a great drive to address many of these issues. The questions that come up, especially in the context of carbon footprint across the board, whether it's operations, whether it's data servers, whatever it is. Now, the only thing that I will call out is, a question as precise as, are you thinking in the context of your project? It's almost like you cannot have that decision at that micro level, because if you are trying to optimize at that granular level, you may actually create an inefficiency on a much broader scale. So I think there is a fair balance that you have to really keep in mind. The analogy that comes to my mind is, frankly speaking, airlines industry. Many a times airlines have unfilled routes largely because it fits in a better logistical data model for themselves as to how they actually drive business and they drive value for the flights that are in scope. So I think we just need to be cautious about it, but I can tell you, I can guarantee you there is a great awareness and drive to get to lower footprint and to meet our commitments that we are making broadly across the industry and the business in the area of carbon capture and the carbon footprint. So, yep.
Yeah, and I would say just one point. I think the oil and gas industry takes a beating on this, and I would argue that across sectors, I think oil and gas industry is taking a leadership position when it comes to carbon footprint and carbon reduction. Hands down. I would challenge anybody to come and tell me what's different. So I think the industry should get credit for the work they've been doing on this.
And I agree with both of you. Yeah, and it's actually in an oil and gas industry, it's built into our DNA now. To just look at the carbon footprint, and that's our goal. If we don't do that, we're not going to achieve our goal. So that is everything we do. That is an element that we consider.
And it's not just words. There's a real passion, there's a real drive and efforts that are taking place in this area. So I completely agree with that.
Yeah, like you look at carbon footprint, look at diversity and inclusion. I think this industry is taking leadership position on all of them. And I would challenge anyone to tell me otherwise. For sure.
I totally agree. Yeah, and it's interesting, Biju, because it picks up on a comment you made earlier, which is like, how does this industry communicate effectively? And I realize historically, communication around this topic has not been effective, right? And I think that has really impeded a lot of people's understanding of the issue and, frankly, the amount of effort that's going in to fix it. And so I think it's a really good call out for ways in which to think about going forward.
Yeah, I think the comms people and companies should get credit. And the fight is in social media now. It's not so much in print and video. I think it's fight is on social media where the people are, and that's where you have to take it to really communicate this.
We've got about 3 more minutes. And so I was going to sort of say, if there's any sort of final thoughts for each of you to be able to share with the group, I think we've covered a lot around people, a lot around culture, a lot about what it takes to kind of take concepts and get them successfully rolled out across enterprise. And frankly, sort of the top-down initiatives that are required, I think, from digital transformation. If there's other things just to leave the panel with and to be able to sort of talk to the, sort of the message that you'd like to share with the audience, I would just love to go around and so Biju, if there's any parting thoughts, and then we'll go Norden and Monica, and we'll wrap up.
I think a couple, and we kind of talked about it. I think lead from the front, really understand what it is from a leader perspective first. Before you expect everybody else to understand, it's like understand before you understood kind of a model.
Yeah.
And change comes from the things you pay attention to. That's simple.
Well said. Indeed.
And I would say, the agility. Agility is the key to drive successful transformation. Any transformation, you have to be agile. And the culture is the second point that I want to mention. Culture and agility plays a key role.
Yep. I think that's
And from my perspective, Peter, it's start from the vision. That is the starting point. Make it consumable. Make the value proposition visible to your stakeholders. And that will actually challenge everybody to define the KPIs that suit you for the consumable chunk. There is no one size fits all. And I think if we chase that, we will possibly lose out. That's my only suggestion.
Yeah. As my father-in-law likes to tell me, repetition pierces the dullest of minds. He's telling me that, so I don't know what his message is. But I think that consistency of message, that ability to be able to share that vision, and I think, Biju, picking up on something you said earlier, which is like consistently telling that story, consistently driving that, and being the agent of change from the leader is not something that can be delegated. You're right. It's something that needs to be carried forward.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to tell people you don't know all the answers. I think it's okay. I think we're in a different world.
Totally.
I think people will understand it, and people will probably give you credit, and they'll probably wonder how they can help you. Versus thinking that you have all the answers. And I think we should give leaders credit for that, saying it's okay, you're a human like everybody else.
And this speaks to something else, and unfortunately we're not going to get a chance to take any of the questions, but the idea around collaboration, right? Which is like, how do you empower your people? How do you bring out the best of them? And part of that is, as a leader, being able to say, like, I don't necessarily know what's best, but I'm willing to work with you to figure that out. Sort of that goal towards, we talk about it internally as like collaborative control. Like, how do you empower your best people? How do you bring out like their unique skills and get the most out of them? That is a critical challenge going forward. And we'll be talking about it in 15 minutes, actually, in another session.
Perfect.
All right. I think that covers it. So I just want to say thank you all very much for the time today. Hopefully the broader group found this as interesting as I did. And look forward to having a great rest of the conference. So Mark, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much to everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks for the useful tips that people can take back to the office. So special thanks to Nordin, Bijou, Peter, Monica. We'll take a short break now.